For the turtle page, we're going to be creating a more traditional two-column layout. So instead of having the text wrap around and interact with the images, we're going to actually create two full columns so we can explore how we would use floats to do something like this. I'm going to go into my turtle page and we're going to add a little bit more text so we have some more text to work with. So now we have some text on the page, and if we look in the browser, we're going to have something that looks like this. And what we're going to want to do here is we're going to have our paragraph text be in one column, and then we're going to have images display in the other column. So for this example, let's put our images on the left and the text on the right. In order to be able to organize this information, I'm going to have to think about the different hooks that I can use so that I can surround or control all of my paragraphs uniquely. And in order to do this, I'm probably going to need to use some sort of HTML element. So because I have multiple paragraphs, it makes sense to wrap my paragraphs inside of a containing item. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a div this time, and I'm choosing to use div because this is a block level element instead of an inline element, and I'm going to call this one I call 2 for the name of the div that I'm using. And then I'm going to go ahead and move my closing div tag so that it closes after my closing paragraph tag. So now the div surrounds these three paragraphs. I said that I wanted to have my images appear on the left. So before that div with a class of I call 2, we're going to create another div, and this one we'll just give a class of I call 1. And then inside of this div, we're going to put some images. So I'm going to use my img tag, and I'll point to the images that I want. I'll add my alt tag, and we'll close our image. And then I'm just going to copy this image right here, and we'll paste this in. And this one is going to be turtle 02. And let's also add a little bit of text here. So alright, if we save the page and we check this out inside of the browser, our page now looks like this. So you can see here's my first image, here is my text, and here's my second image, and here's the text. And I just realized I need to flip-flop my descriptive text, so we'll adjust that. Alright, now the text is going to go with the appropriate picture. But needless to say, we have the image, we have the text, we have the image, we have the text, and then we have the paragraphs. Remember what I said, I wanted this to be more of a multi-column or two-column layout. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to make some rules so that we can control this in the manner that we want. The first thing that I need to establish is I need to establish how much width I want to give for each of the columns that I'm going to use. The width that you end up using is going to be dictated by the content that exists inside of that column. So in this first column, I'm going to have my descriptive text and my images, so I need to figure out how wide I want that column to be. We're just going to use a width of 250 pixels. Knowing that I want to make the width 250 pixels, I need to then find out how much remaining width I have left. So as you recall, if we look in our CSS file, we have a container that has a width of 960 pixels that wraps around everything. So if I took that 960 and subtracted 250, which is the width I want for the first column, I have 710 pixels left. That's how much pixel width I can assign to that second column. So knowing that is going to allow me to set up my columns in the right way. I'm going to go ahead and come down here and I'll make another CSS comment. CSS comments are great for staying organized, and we're just going to say multi-column layout. And this is just to remind us what's going on. So I have class names, and I used I call 1 for the first one, and we already said that we were going to assign a width of 250 pixels. And then we're going to make another rule for I call 2, and we're going to assign a width of 710 pixels. Now, In addition to assigning these width values, I also need to assign the float values, because if we were to save right now and look in our browser, you're going to simply see that the images are going to appear stacked because now they only have this much space, and then the text does not fill the entire area because again it only has this much space. So now we want these things to appear side by side. We do that by utilizing our floats. So if we come back into our CSS rule, I'm going to tell the iColumn1 to float on the left, and generally when we add floating on the left, we'll add padding or margin to the right. So remember now, if I want to add padding or margin, I need to subtract that from my overall width from somewhere else, because 710 and 250 add 960. So if I was to add a padding on the right, and let's just add padding on the right of 15 pixels, I would need to make sure that I subtracted that somewhere else. So I'm going to subtract it from this value right here. So I'll change this number to be 695. So again, whenever you add, you always have to subtract so the math all works out. Now, if we were to save right now and we were to look at this in our browser, you can see that it is doing what we asked it to do. We are having some issues with this image, and that's because this image actually is 300 pixels. I'm going to use some CSS just to be able to change the size of this. We talked about that in an earlier movie and why it may or may not be such a good idea, but for our purposes here, we are going to do that. It did allow us to be able to display these things in a 2-column layout, but we still have this issue where there's a lot of weird space over here and to the right, and that's because this content, this div that contains these 3 paragraphs, it's being pulled up and it's appearing to the right hand side of the images. I can show you this visually by putting a background color on iCol2. So let me just temporarily add a background color so I can show you what happens. I'm just going to add a background color of yellow just so we can see what's going on here. So we'll just specify that background color. If I refresh the page now, you can see that the background color actually goes behind or underneath the images. And that's kind of how floats work. When you use floats, they pull the content that follows the float to the left or the right, and then it actually is kind of slipping almost behind it. So in order to prevent this from happening, what we're going to do is we're going to assign a float to the div call 2 as well. Let's go into the iCol2 and let's assign a float. And at this point you could float left or right. I like to just kind of keep floating left. That makes more sense to me. But if we float it on the right, it would also work in this particular example. I'm going to save and I'll refresh this, and now you can see that this works more in the manner that we kind of want it to work, where the text is filling this whole area. You can see by the yellow background where the text is actually going. So this looks better. It's more along the lines of what we want. Let's go ahead and let's make some additional changes to this first column so this looks a little bit better. We need to have some indentation along the left. We're going to reduce the size of the images. We need to format the text that's appearing here. So let's take care of those things. I'll get rid of this yellow color since we don't need this anymore. And I'm going to go back to iCol2. In addition to the padding on the right, I'm going to also add some padding on the left so that the images are not right on the left side. So I'll use shorthand notation instead of using specific notation, and we're going to keep the padding on the top at 0. The padding on the right will be 15 pixels. The padding on the bottom is going to be 0, and the padding on the left will be 15 pixels. Now I could write it like this, and that would be specifying all 4 values, or I could simply write it like this. When you have 2 values in padding or margin or border or whatever, it is going to know, the browser knows that the first value is top and bottom and the second value is right or left. So we can just keep it like that. We're going to change our font size to 80%. We're going to change the color of the font to a gray color. We're going to change this font style to italic, and we're going to change the text alignment to center. And then I need to deal with the size of the images. So the size of the images need to have a more specific rule. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to make a more specific rule, and we'll make a rule for iCol1, space img, so we're using a more specific selector here, and I'm going to specify that the width of these images be 200 pixels. If I don't specify the height, it's going to resize the images proportionately. So if I come into my browser and we refresh, you can now see the images are not being resized. Let's see what we have here. Oh, I forgot my period right in front of the selector name. So that's obviously really important. I'll add that period back in so that it knows that it's a class, and then we'll refresh. And now you can see how these are working in the way that we want. Now, because I've done this, I also have some issues with my text is not appearing to the right, and that's because the math no longer works out. So we need to come back into the browser, and remember when I added the padding on the right and the left of 15 pixels, I never subtracted it out. So what I need to do is I need to subtract another 15 pixels from somewhere. So I'm just going to take it off of iCal2. I'll change this to be 680 pixels. And the other thing I noticed is I want my text to appear under the image, so I'm going to tell these guys to display as block level elements, and that will force the text to appear underneath it. So if we save now and we refresh, now the page is working a little bit more to kind of what we had planned. Now I realize visually, once I look at this, that my width over here on the iCal1 is kind of too big once I resize my pictures down. So I need to either make my picture a little bigger or maybe make this column a little bit smaller. So let's go ahead and just take care of that real quickly. We told the images to have a width of 200. The width of the column is 250. So why don't we bring our images up so that they're closer to what the column width is. Let's just give them a size of 250 pixels, and we'll check that out in the browser. That looks much better. All right, so now our page is working in the manner that we want. We have a 2-column layout, and you can see by handling the CSS a little bit differently, we're able to get very different treatments and very different looks on these pages. And hopefully this is helping you to understand and solidify how you can use floats to be able to control your layouts.